One day while working on the show Panorama, I came across an anonymous letter from a social worker in the UK. They described young children being left in offices for hours alone, long into the night, waiting to be housed in emergency foster care, for the situation to then repeat the next night and then the next and then the next. They questioned the purpose of their role when children were being traumatised, confessing that children in their care were sleeping in camp beds in kitchens due to foster homes being full. These disruptive environments were causing the children's behaviour to deteriorate, which in turn made them harder and harder to place with foster carers, in a callous cycle of instability. This is the reality of foster care today. Overworked and under-resourced social workers failing to place children in adequate care. There is a persistent nationwide shortage of foster carers, driven by year-on-year decreases in foster care applications and increasing numbers of children entering the care system. But that wasn't the end of the letter. They lamented the fact that their councils were being bankrupted by the cost of children's social care, blaming private foster care agencies who were charging extortionate fees to their council and raking in staggeringly high profits at the same time. And they were right. The suffering of our most vulnerable children in society has become a multi-billion industry goldmine for private equity. How did this happen? When did we decide any of this? This is the first in a two-part series detailing the story about how children's social care was secretly privatised and turned into an exploitative, morally bankrupt business model that allows the rich to profit from human misery. In the 1980s, local authority care homes were transferred to the private sector as part of a wider strategy of privatisation enacted by Thatcher.
From France to the Philippines, from Jamaica to Japan, from Malaysia to Mexico, from Sri Lanka to Singapore, privatisation is on the move.
The NHS and Community Care Act 1990 took away local authorities' responsibilities to provide care directly, replacing it with the duty to buy care often from private profit-making businesses. This resulted in a permanent shift of residential care from the public sector to private companies. The number of places in private residential care homes went from 37,400 in 1980 to 155,600 in 1990. This was the first domino to fall in a terrible series that has resulted in our current children's social care crisis. The second domino would fall in 2006 with the Blair government's Care Matters report, introduced by then Education Secretary Alan Johnson.
Alan Johnson. I'm in love.
No, not that Alan Johnson. At the time, there were serious concerns about the lack of social worker autonomy in highly bureaucratic councils. The high turnover of social workers was also a concern, and both issues were thought to be worsening outcomes for children in care. To combat this issue, the Care Matters report proposed the establishment of independent social work practices. These small partner SWPs were soon piloted in struggling local authorities and championed by Julian Legrand. Legrand was a senior Blair advisor and architect of our current quasi-market privatised system that New Labour implemented. Here's an article written at the time by Legrand advocating for SWPs. You see, he's cleverly replaced the word care with business. Giving the game away there, Julian. In this article, he writes that the partners would have an incentive to do as an effective job as possible in order to generate a surplus on their budget to spend on themselves, on improving the facilities, or on hiring more staff. And, in a social care practice world, local authorities would specify the budgets for practices and monitor the quality of the service being provided. This logic is airtight if you completely misunderstand how capitalism works. Like what happens to the budget surplus when small providers are bought up by larger companies? What happens to incentives when councils are forced to use your services regardless of their quality, due to high demand and monopolised provision, eliminating choice? Keep Julian Legrand in mind, as we'll return to him later. So in their intended form, what were the results of these SWP pilots? Frankly, they were underwhelming. In a 2012 evaluation of the policy, it stated, incentives to reduce payment costs and staff job insecurity were causing children more disruption, which was the exact opposite of what the SWPs were meant to deliver.
A spokesman said, "This is the one thing we didn't want to happen."
There was limited evidence to support outsourcing council children's services to the independent or private sector, or why this small practice strategy had to occur outside the existing public sector. Following the financial crash, New Labour have voted out, and the Tories and Lib Dems form a coalition government. In 2011, Michael Gove commissions Eileen Munro, the UK's leading expert on child protection, to carry out a review of the sector. She recommends services become more child-centred and less bureaucratic, especially for social workers who were stuck behind computers rather than doing direct work with children. Despite the damning evidence against SWPs, and Munro's review, which never advocated for further privatisation, Gove gets to work on the final phase of outsourcing. First, he goes after social care workers, singling them out and leaving out the role of the police, health workers and schools. He accuses them of being not up to the job, more concerned with giving struggling families access to benefits than making them change behaviours. As if Tory austerity would have no effect on the outcomes of the poorest children in our society. Spoiler alert, it does. Gove weaponises recent tragedies like the Baby P and Hamza Khan stories, and similar ones of terrible abuse and neglect. He does this to scapegoat social workers, demoralise councils and push for his reforms. Finally, Gove weaponises Ofsted as an arm to further demoralise councils into accepting outsourcing. Standards are heightened, terminology is made harsher, like adequate changing to requires improvement. Independent expert panels are brought in with no child protection expertise to allocate blame to council workers. Gove and his children's minister, Edward Timpson, begin assembling a crack team of the best outsourcing consultants in the business. One was Alan Wood, the go-to fixer in child protection. He got noticed after turning around the long-failing Hackney Council into a major success story that would come to be known as the Hackney model. He shares the credit for Hackney with Isabel Trowler and Steve Goodman, the architects of his tough reforms. In their shake-up, a quarter of social workers either left or were told they had not made the grade. Alongside Wood and Trowler was Norman Warner, a Labour peer and long-time outsourcing advocate. In 2013, he wrote why I, a Labour peer, am supporting a regulated market for NHS competition. Yeah, you heard that right. In 2014, Warner called for a £10 a month NHS membership fee. He wrote this in a pamphlet funded by the think tank Restate, formerly known as Reform. Alongside the membership fee, it recommended removing services from the NHS altogether and turning the NHS into a salesman for the pharmaceutical industry. The only paper that bothered investigating this report was the Morning Star, who wrote an absolutely scathing article on the private interests behind Warner's rhetoric. They found Restate was funded by a range of NHS outsourcing companies, including Serco and G4S. Serco, with a history of committing fraud and long history of failures, including the 2013 electronic tagging scandal, where they were caught charging for electronic tagging of individuals who were dead, in prison or had left the country, and their disastrous management of prison services. G4S, not to be outdone, with its overcharging on contracts to tag offenders, its inept management of private prisons, failure to deliver security for the 2012 Olympics, and the criminal abuse of children in custody that Panorama uncovered.
That's when I started like, giving him dicks and hand on his head and I was probably trying to break his skull.
No government in their right mind would ever let these companies anywhere near children again, right? So in regard to Warner's NHS report, the real story was, as the Morning Star so delicately put it, private health spokesman Lord Warner calls for NHS charges in pamphlet funded by private health firms. Unlike the rest of the team, Warner's naked self-interest in lobbying for private companies is so transparent, it's almost refreshing.
What the public need to be aware of is the proponents of more market, more privatisation and the insurance model. We need to look at these people's conflicts of interest. Lord Warner works as an advisor for Zansa, a technology firm, and Biotrol, an antimicrobial company, which both sell services and products to the NHS, paid by DLA Piper, which advises ministers on the 12 billion IT project for the NHS, projects that he was responsible for when he was a government minister. The whole Department of Health has been inundated with people with vested interest in privatisation.
All right, I'll tell you what, Bob. Just hold it there. You are pushing an agenda that's driven by vested interest. That's quite a serious accusation. How do you answer?
That's not true. I just declare my interest. I also do work. I'm doing work in Birmingham for the government on trying to improve the children's public services in Birmingham.
Last but not least in this unsavoury alliance was Julian Legrand. I told you he'd be back. This time for the Tories, he builds upon his previous work under Blair towards privatisation. The team get to work laying the groundwork for Gove and Timpson's final phase. Here's Julian and the gang pushing Birmingham, a vulnerable council, to outsource their social care provision to the private sector, followed by Lord Warner, who is sent as a commissioner to Birmingham by Edward Timpson to carry out Legrand's outsourcing recommendations.
6 months ago, the government appointed Lord Warner to act as an independent Children's Commissioner for Birmingham.
In 2014, the final domino falls, plunging children's social care into full privatisation. In April, Gove outlines plans to enable councils to outsource their child social care provision to the private and independent sector. There is a suspiciously short 6-week consultation period to sneak through the regulations with little media coverage, and yet the public opposition was still overwhelming, with 94% of over 1,300 responses being opposed to opening up children's services to the private sector. Eileen Munro, the author of Michael Gove's 2011 review, disavows the proposals, stating it's a bad idea and that children's care should not be delegated to a profit-making organisation. Alongside this, a letter signed by 37 senior academics urges the government not to privatise children's social care.
None of us, and I'm talking about a large number of academics and professionals who are very concerned about this, are aware of any evidence that suggests that privatising children's services are necessary and would be beneficial for children. And in fact, we believe the opposite is true.
Gove's lackeys get on the defensive. In response to the letter, Alan Wood disparages the academics and dismisses their concerns. He states,
I think the idea that Serco or G4S or Virgin are going to come riding over a hill on a horse and sweep up a whole series of child protection services is complete and utter madness. They are not daft. They are not going to pick up businesses where the level of risk and threat are so bloody serious that it would bankrupt them in 5 minutes.
A masterclass in how to be obnoxious and wrong. Trowler tweeted at the same time that those who opposed the reforms were like living in Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Despite these jibes from his team, Gove issues a press release signalling a U-turn from their proposals. Private sector companies would not be allowed to receive contracts for children's social care. And everyone breathed a sigh of relief. That was, until a few weeks later, the government issued its revised regulations that still allowed private companies to be given contracts. By simply setting up a non-profit subsidiary, the parent company could charge whatever it wanted for services provided. On the 3rd of September 2014, a government committee debates Gove and Timpson's new regulations. Timpson states,
Our swift response on the question of profit-making shows the seriousness with which the government have taken the views expressed. I hope this consultation demonstrates that this is not the case and has resulted in a significant amendment to the proposed draft.
Labour MP Steve McCabe, with a long background working in social care, responds with,
What specific steps will he take to ensure that larger profit-making groups will not simply set up not-for-profit subsidiaries in order to bid for the work?
Meg Munn, a Labour backbencher MP and not a committee member, states,
As we have heard, there is nothing to prevent companies setting up not-for-profit subsidiaries to do the work and charging them excessive management fees. Will the Minister be clear about the government's intentions? Which organisations has the Department for Education been working with on the implementation of the proposals? Are they for-profit or not-for-profit organisations?
Here I believe Meg Munn was alluding to the government's primary aim, which was to privatise children's social care, something Timpson and Gove have never acknowledged publicly. Timpson counters.
It is right that if they have a not-for-profit subsidiary, they can apply to carry out some of the functions, but of course they still cannot make a profit either directly or indirectly as a consequence of that arrangement. So in the scenario that the Honourable Member for South Shields described, a profit would be created as a consequence of that contract, so that could not happen. On excessive management fees, if a local authority wants to enter into a contract with excessive management fees attached, that is a matter for them. At a time when budgets are tight and local authorities are having to make difficult choices, it would be perverse to spend money on excessive management fees when a much better deal could be obtained by looking elsewhere. So I do not accept that that is a direct consequence of these changes.
This was the airtight logic behind privatising public services. The market provides choice, which keeps costs down, which of course fails if the provision is monopolised by larger companies and choice and competition is of course eliminated. In response to Timpson's point about the elimination of profit from contracts, another Labour backbencher, Emma Llewellyn-Buck, points out,
in the example that the Minister gave, companies would not be allowed to carry out functions if there was a profit involved. But who will actually monitor whether they do that? Who will keep track of whether this is happening?
Local authorities have a responsibility to discharge their functions. They are inspected against their ability to do that, so there is a clear accountability structure in place.
Timpson's retort fails to consider how a council that is obliged to provide social care will have to accept contracts regardless of quality in a monopolised market. It also ignores the fact that at the time government was mercilessly cutting council budgets while child protection cases were rising year on year. This would obviously lead to a weakening of council oversight on their contracts. Labour debate Timpson's regulations but do not formally oppose them. This is despite being the serving opposition party. Committee member and frontbencher Steve McCabe states,
I considered calling for a vote on the matter because of the number of representations I've received from people who are deeply concerned about the government's motives, and because of the fact that 94% of respondents to the consultation opposed the change. I decided against that course of action only because I acknowledged that the measures are intended as enabling legislation.
I don't see how someone who recognises the sheer scale of opposition and just how dangerous these regulations were still decides not to vote against them. I reached out to Meg Munn to comment. She stated she requested to be on the committee but was refused, that she didn't know why the Labour frontbench took the view they did, but thought it irresponsible. In this debate, Timpson, time and time again, assured the committee that there will be no profiteering off the back of these regulations, that improving the support and protection of children was their primary aim.
I am absolutely committed to doing everything I can to improve the support and protection we provide to our vulnerable children, and the regulations represent an important step in the right direction.
And despite all of these assurances that profiteering would not occur on these most vulnerable children, in government messaging like Gove's press conferences and Timpson's own words in this committee debate. In the same month, The Guardian uncovered a secret meeting ran by the Department for Education to attract private contractors into a new child safeguarding market that was being created. These regulations were outlined to an audience of private outsourcing companies, including Virgin Care and Amy, in what one attendee described as a sales pitch for privatising core children's social care work activity. Another attendee said, "This is radically different to existing outsourcing. This is crown jewel stuff." The seminar was chaired by our favourite private lobbyist, Lord Warner, with the old gang including Julian Legrand, Alan Wood, Isabel Trowler and Edward Timpson himself attending as speakers. After 2014, large outsourcing companies began buying up these independent SWPs that were championed by Julian Legrand. The private sector increased its market share of children's homes and fostering agencies year on year and were then eventually hoovered up by private equity. Huge monopolies quickly emerged, eliminating competition and giving private companies freedom to choose whatever price they wish. 83% of children's homes are now owned by the private sector. 91% of all fostering placements are provided by private agencies. In contrast, the independent non-profit sector, pitched as the intended successor to council provision by Gove and his team, account for only 9% of fostering placements. Alan Wood and Isabel Trowler, please tell me again how this was never about privatisation. The largest 4 foster agencies are all owned by private equity. 8 of the largest private children's home owners are private equity owned. This is how children's social care was secretly privatised against the wishes of the British public. All major British political parties, like the Conservatives, like Labour, and the Liberal Democrats, were complicit in this process. Advisors like Legrand, Lord Warner, Alan Wood, and Isabel Trowler were paid very well by the Department for Education to introduce private interests into children's care. Isabel Trowler became the government's first chief social worker. Alan was later knighted for his efforts. Edward Timpson was in many ways a typical Tory, public school education, rich family business. But Edward Timpson grew up and shared his home as a child with over 90 fostered children that he helped look after. He saw up close the plight of these vulnerable children and the generosity of foster carers like his parents, who gave their entire lives to helping others. How could he do this? Surely he would know the consequences. Michael Gove's reforms allowed the privatisation of every aspect of children's social care, except adoption services. Gove himself was placed in care when he was a baby and was later adopted. He has personal experience of being in care. If privatisation was such a force of innovation that would improve outcomes, why would he not privatise adoption services too? Either Gove and Timpson actually believed that these private companies would improve child outcomes by cutting bureaucracy and making them more competitive, or they benefited somehow from these reforms in some way that I wasn't able to find. Short-sighted and incompetent, or corrupt and self-serving. Back in the 2014 debate, committee member Steve McCabe, speaking to Timpson, would utter these grave words.
If people's worst fears are realised and these measures prove to be the route to fragmented, unaccountable, unregulated provision riddled with conflicts of interest and dubious financial incentives, a future government will have to repeal them. By that time, however, thousands of children might have suffered needlessly. This decision will become the minister's legacy. That would be a tragedy for a man who's done so much good in the time he has occupied the post.
In part 2 of this series, we will take a look at that legacy. The full extent of profiteering, systemic failures, the abuse of children, and the bankrupting of councils. All for rich owners and private equity that I will identify. But first, I also wanted to appreciate those who resisted this process. You may remember Ray Jones from the 2014 opposition letter. Ray had been tracking the coalition's intentions since the beginning. In 2013, he accurately predicted Gove's strategy in laying the groundwork for privatisation. In 2015, he wrote an essay on the privatisation of children's social care, which has been instrumental to this video's research. He would later write an entire book on the subject. I spoke to Ray a few times when making this video, and he was quick to offer his expertise and his clarity. Naomi Phillips also wrote a fantastic piece on this subject for the Tribune, as did Katharine Quarmby in the Byline Times. This is a national scandal that is still unfolding every day, from underfunded, abuse-ridden foster homes across this country, straight to offshore private equity who are extracting billions from this industry and loading up their companies with debt that they own. In the next part, I'm going to expose the worst private companies in the business, showing how much they profit from our children with our tax money. Please like and subscribe to make sure you see it.